Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Tom Hastings, and I'm an educator for the Artesian Alliance, which includes Cheehaw Park and Zoo, Flint River Aquarium, and Thranatiska Heritage Center. So today we are going to be talking about an important topic that has impacts on both people and wildlife, as well as the environment. So it's a really important topic, and what we are going to talk about is natural disasters. And we're going to focus a little bit more on flooding, and that's important because flooding is actually the most common natural disaster that occurs in the United States. And so natural disasters are any severe weather that has the potential to pose a threat to human health and safety, to infrastructure, which can include things like our roads, bridges, hospitals, important buildings. Natural disasters are important to understand because they do pose these threats, but also oftentimes they can occur without any prior warning and can be a little bit unpredictable. Now, with that being said, some natural disasters are also somewhat seasonal, so we can have a better understanding of when we may need to be aware or a little bit more conscious of when these might occur. And so again, some can be seasonal, and we'll discuss that a little bit, but also natural disasters can occur without any warning. So it's really important to be prepared. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to prepare for natural disasters, because being prepared is the best defense. And so we're going to start off by talking about some different kinds of natural disasters. Then we're going to move into flooding, and we're going to discuss what you can do prior to, during, and following a flood event. And then we're going to talk about how floods can be impactful for the environment, people, and wildlife. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to help us study some different natural disasters and everything else I just mentioned. Okay, so before we get into floods, the first I want to talk about is blizzards or extreme winter conditions. So the big thing that is concerning about winter storms is the rate at which snow can accumulate sometimes. So really when you need to worry about extreme winter storms is when there are rates of accumulation at very short or within very short time periods. And so if this happens, it can make travel very dangerous. It can prevent travel altogether, and it can create things like power outages, which can then be concerning because oftentimes people rely on things like heat. And so what oftentimes up in the north, I know we don't have to worry about that too often here in Georgia, but up in the north, people will go to stores and they will stock up on food and water to make sure that they have enough to get through any potential winter storms. And what's nice about winter storms is they actually can be predicted pretty well. There are also tornadoes. So tornadoes are definitely a type of extreme natural disaster. So they are caused by thunderstorms. It's not known exactly how yet, but essentially thunderstorms can develop into tornadoes, and there can be some upward type spiraling wind of up to 100 miles per hour. Tornadoes can last for over an hour and can travel dozens of miles. So there's definitely potential for lots of damage to occur from these cycling air masses that have contact with the ground, which is what helps define a tornado. And this is one of those types of natural disasters I was mentioning has a season involved with it. So natural disasters like tornadoes can have a season in Georgia that ranges from March until May. And so I know I've actually gotten a couple alerts for them. But what's nice is that we're getting better too at monitoring weather conditions 24/7, being able to forecast when these may occur a little bit. And what's really nice is they have the ability to put out warnings now to people if any do pop up. And so warnings give us time to be able to seek shelter and to be prepared for these natural disasters, hopefully before they even reach us. And so especially in areas where tornadoes are more common, people have started to build things such as cellars that they can go into the ground and be protected from tornadoes. Even just the structure of homes and how homes are being designed these days, especially again in areas where tornadoes are a little bit more prevalent, are being designed in a way that can withstand these types of storms or weather patterns. And so between getting warnings out now and just being prepared in terms of building stronger homes these days and structures, we can help people be a little bit more safe during these storms. But one of the most important things with tornadoes in terms of being prepared is having a location picked out in your house and having that in the back of your head at all times. So everybody, especially in areas where they're more relevant, should have a location in their home that is already in their head, so that if this ever does happen, they know exactly where they're going to go without any hesitation. So that's a big one for sure. And that's typically going to be more towards the center of your house and away from things like windows. Okay, there's hurricanes. So hurricanes are a really important one to understand. And essentially what these are low pressure storm systems that start out in the ocean or in the Gulf. And they actually strengthen while they're over the water in this rotating wind pattern. And so surface winds moving over the water pick up strength before they even reach land. And the winds within hurricanes can range anywhere from 74 to 200 miles per hour. And a storm won't even necessarily be considered a hurricane until it reaches those speeds. But even if it's not, it can still come on land as a tropical storm. And even those storms have potential to be really dangerous due to some of the other impacts that definitely come along with hurricanes. And that includes things such as high wind speeds. So even winds that are 60 mile an hour can still do damage, right? Hurricanes can help start up some tornadoes. They can help start tornadoes, and that's because there's also thunderstorms associated with hurricanes. And there's a number of different water impacts that can be associated with hurricanes. So the first is hurricanes, especially if they're slow moving, they have potential to just dump a lot of water. Because if you think about it, they're bringing all of this water that they're collecting while they're moving over the ocean on land. And so once they move on land, depending on the speed, if they just sit, sometimes hurricanes will just move at extremely slow paces. And if that's the case, they have potential to just dump lots of water on land. And so that can lead to flooding, which is the next big water impact associated with hurricanes. But then there's also other things like as that wind is moving on land, wind will push the water towards land. And so that can create huge storm surge, which is just essentially the water level rising as it approaches the coast. And so storm surges are another big source or potential cause of flooding, and that can be really dangerous as well. So what this picture is, this is actually a picture of Hurricane Katrina from space. And so you can see how it was forming out here in the Gulf and then moving inland over the United States. So pretty cool picture actually, but a really important storm because there are lots of impacts. And the combination of heavy amounts of water as well as wind can be really damaging. And then there's other natural disasters that we're not going to go too in depth with, but there's a number of other ones, right? Including things like earthquakes. Earthquakes and flooding can sometimes lead to landslides. So these top two pictures are the aftermath of earthquakes. There's wildfires. So we know there's a lot of fires occurring in California now. So this is a big one. This has the potential to do a lot of damage to homes, especially if fires start moving towards more residential or urban areas. And then that brings us finally to flooding. So there are a number of different things that cause flooding, and there's a number of things to think about when talking about flooding. The first is sort of like natural disasters in general, where they can be predicted or not. Sort of along the same lines, floods can range anywhere from developing slowly and being predictable to flash floods that occur with little notice. And so that range has some potential to cause some problems, especially with flash flooding. So oftentimes when we think about things like hurricanes bringing flooding, we are going to have those predictions happen with forecasting from weather services, and they will be able to predict how much water is going to accumulate or even get dropped in terms of rainfall. So with those, that's not going to happen as fast, or we're going to see, or at least we're going to have some prior warning. They can even predict now storm surge and how much water can come on land from storm surges as these hurricanes move on land. And that gives us an idea of what kind of flooding we're going to be dealing with. So oftentimes the Weather Service, when there are major storms like hurricanes moving on land, they'll give predictions of rainfall and storm surge or that sea level rise. But also really heavy rainfall events can cause flash flooding that occurs really rapidly. And so these are all pictures that show how severe they can be. This bottom left-hand corner, you can see, you can't even see sidewalks or driveways or lawns because all of these houses are in completely flooded water. In this bottom right-hand picture, the thing that really does it for me is the street signs are almost completely underwater. So that's at least, what, 4 to 5 feet of water built up. I included this other picture in the top because it points out a number of different things that are relevant to floods and things that you should consider. And I'll talk about this a bit more when I go through my checklist of things that you should do prior to, during, and following a flood. But the first thing you notice is cars. So floodwaters can be strong enough and rapid enough to move cars. And also you see some power lines here going into the water. So that's really important, and we'll talk about that. Okay, and when we talk about, we'll go back for a second. So some things when thinking about flooding, prior to flooding, sort of like the tornado I mentioned, having a spot picked out, that's one of the biggest things you can do prior to flood events too, is first of all, learn about where you're living, determine if you're in a location that's more prone to flood. So there are things such as floodplains where flooding can be a little bit more common or severe. So learn about where you are and what your likelihood of flooding is. If you are in an area where flooding may be likely, have a plan ready for sure. So it's just as important to pick a spot where you know you're going to go if flooding starts to occur. And also have resources stocked away at that location. So non-perishable foods is really important, and sources of water in case you have to wait it out for potentially over a day or more. So you want to have several days worth of food and water at your safe spot is what we'll call it. And having that picked out in advance is important. Some people even recommend practicing evacuation routes so you know if a flood occurs where you're going to go, so that while it's happening, you don't panic and try to make a last minute call. But if you already practice and plan, then you'll definitely have a better outcome in terms of trying to escape floodwaters. So those are all things you can do in preparations. Learning about your area, if you're in an area that calls for it, plan something out, even if you're not, right? Natural disasters, unpredictable, so it doesn't hurt to plan something out anyway. But then if a flood does occur, the most important things you can do is get to that safe spot and stay there unless otherwise noted. Do not try to evacuate unless noted, but if there are evacuation orders, then you should do so, and you should do so safely. So when evacuating, if necessary, never go into water. So the two big numbers to know is 6 inches. Only 6 inches of water can knock you down, and a foot of water, 12 inches, is enough to move a vehicle, which is, you wouldn't think so. You wouldn't think just a foot of water would be enough, but it is. So don't drive through water. A good rule of thumb is if you can't see the bottom, don't go through it. And that's oftentimes going to be the case with floodwaters. Something you're going to notice with all of these pictures is these floodwaters are not clean. And that's super important for both people and for wildlife, and we'll talk about for wildlife in a little bit. But just don't drive through it, especially if there's barricades. Those barricades are put up on purpose, sometimes in preparation of floods, to tell people where deep spots may be. So don't try to drive around them and go through an area anyway. Go around them, avoid it. Do not go through those areas, and don't walk through water if you can't tell how deep it is. And that's if you have to evacuate. The other thing they recommend is if you are going to go to a safe spot in your house, don't go to an attic, because you definitely don't want to run the risk of getting trapped in somewhere if floodwaters do get high enough. But your safe spot's usually going to be on a floor that's high enough to avoid water in general. And then following a flood, the first thing is not to go back until it's cleared to do so, and you've received word that it's safe to go back to your house or your home or wherever you live. And then once you are back, if there are damages, there's a number of things you can do to protect yourself when dealing with damages. The first is to wear safety gear like gloves and boots, because you don't know what kind of debris is going to be left over. Avoid things like any sources of electricity that may be near or in water, until you can confirm that power is off. Another big one, which a lot of people probably don't think about, is being wary of animals in the water if there's still water present that may be hiding in the water. So actually, kind of a wild story. I know someone who had a flood occur in Florida, and it flooded their house. And even after the water was gone and they were able to get back in their house, they essentially had to strip everything due to water damage. Everything from the ground up, they had to cut out their walls and insulate their house and everything. So they were taking down their curtains, and what they didn't realize is that when the water's flooded a couple feet up their walls, all the animals that were in their house or that may have come into their house during the flood tried to climb up the curtains to get away from the water. And so when they were pulling the curtains down, they got bit by a lot of spiders, and it caused them to swell up to like twice the size of their arm. And I know this person personally, it's a true story. So it just goes to show that there are things that you may not even be thinking about when these types of things happen, but just like people go to stories or another story up in their house to get out of the water, animals are going to do what they can to get out of the water too. So that's something to be aware of when you come back to your location. But also, you don't even know what kind of debris could be under the water in your house, whether that be things that could be sharp or anything like that. So boots and gloves is definitely helpful and important. Sometimes wearing a mask can be nice. I know we're all used to wearing masks now, right? But in a flood situation, it can be nice to prevent any illness from mold that may be developing due to all the moisture and the water within your home. So lots of things that you can do to prevent injuries and be safe when returning after a flood. And then, so here's, while we're still talking about impacts to people and things like that, at Thronatisca Heritage Center, there's actually a cool little spot where you can check out a historic flood that occurred in Albany. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, because if you want, hopefully you can visit at some point and check it out for yourself. But you can see the floodwaters in Albany right here. And it occurred in 1994 from Tropical Storm Alberto. So remember I said if sometimes hurricanes don't reach the speeds of 74 miles an hour and they still come inland, they can still be considered a tropical storm, and they can still be very dangerous and have impacts. So this is a good example of that. And it dumped over 24 inches of rain, and that's a lot. And so water has actually reached 43 feet, which is wild, and it was dubbed the flood of the century. And so this is just a little bit more of the exhibit you can check out at Thronatisca. You can see things like people up on the roof of their home because the water's got that high, which also, by the way, is not recommended unless absolutely necessary going up on your roof during a flood event. But if necessary, right, it's safer than something else. And then you can check out some cool memories from the flood itself that is displayed at Thronatisca. And so I'll just read one, for example, to give you an idea. It says, the houses are nearly all washed off from the steam mill settlement, and the water is about the floor of the second story of the mill. I worry that it will all go. And so that just gives you an idea of how extreme this event was and how this flood of the century was really impactful. And so, again, that's in Phronetisca Heritage Center if anybody wants to check it out. Okay, so let's talk about impacts on the environment a little bit, because these natural disasters aren't just harmful to people and things like our infrastructure and our buildings and our homes, which is a huge impact. It can also cause a lot of, one of the big things I haven't even mentioned yet, when considering natural disasters and the aftermath, is the economic impact it can have. It can cost a lot of money to recover from natural disasters. So, but environmental impacts are very relevant as well. So one thing is it can cause a lot of pollution. If you think about this, where all of this water is getting dumped and it's all going to start to drain into rivers and watersheds, but it's coming from all over, right? It's getting dumped everywhere and it's going to have to run over land. So there's going to be lots of runoff, lots of potential for it to pick up different chemicals at different locations, pesticides, herbicides, and all of these things can filter into things like rivers and wetlands. And pollution can even be things such as debris. So I was saying be careful for debris in your home, but debris can even be collected within our watershed. So things like downed trees and vegetation and rocks and things can get moved by these really strong waters. And then in watersheds themselves, so rapidly moving water and lots of excess water can cause erosion. It can cause river banks to actually break down a little bit, or it can even widen rivers and streams themselves. And when that's happening, when they're eroding, they're losing a lot of sediment and structure. And so a lot of those particles that are now getting brought downstream are going to get moved to a different location and deposited in other areas. And so that's known as sedimentation. And that can be really impactful for environments and for habitats for certain animals. So if you think about it, one big thing is that lots of little finer particles like clay or sand can fill in gaps in rocks and cobble further downstream. It can also just take up space in general. So if you think about it, if water finally breaches over the banks of rivers and starts to flood on land, sediment can get deposited in areas on land. And then so can chemicals or pesticides or herbicides or pollutants that are in the water. And so it can reduce the quality of things like soil that's on land, or even wetlands can start to get filled in with sediment, and just the overall amount of space in wetlands can be reduced. Things like plants can be uprooted during these storms, so that's going to change structure immediately right away, and that can lead to further erosion in the future. And even plants that are underwater for a while, even if they don't get uprooted, they could die in the future just because they were flooded for too long and couldn't tolerate those conditions. So lots of different ways in which the environment can be impacted, and that's going to lead to lots of impacts on wildlife as well. So any of these changes that occur and alter the environment are going to alter whatever animals are found there. But some more specific example is things like fossorial animals, or any animals that are found in burrows or that go underground, or maybe that hibernate underground, could get washed out of their burrows, or they could even drown if they can't get out of those burrows. Another thing is cloudy water. So I mentioned earlier all those pictures of how murky or muddy the water looked. That can pose some challenges for animals that like to hunt in water, because if that water has gotten that cloudy, I can't see through it. So animals like birds that rely on water to hunt are not going to be able to find their prey. So that can be one source of how food could become limited following a storm. But also just lots of food items could be washed away from different environments. And so food scarcity following a natural disaster can be a big impact for a lot of animals. And then, like I said, there could be a loss of habitat. Plants could be uprooted and dragged away. Again, burrows could be flooded out, things like that. We've already talked about pollution a lot, how water quality can be reduced and can harm different environments, and food shortage. So some more specific examples. Oh, and another big one for birds, which is why I have this picture in here, is there's birds that nest on the ground. And so one direct impact example could be eggs and nests themselves could be washed away, and that's going to directly impact populations of things like birds. The nice thing is that animals can bounce back from these types of events pretty easily. So animals like adult birds can re-nest if they need to, or other individuals could come back and repopulate an area following a natural disaster like this. Another animal that can be directly impacted is the beaver. So they build lodges and dams. So we have a lodge up here in the right-hand corner and dams. And if water, storm water or flooding water gets strong enough and rapid enough, it can wash these structures right out as well. And then lastly, to wrap things up, I thought this is a pretty cool example of how natural disasters such as floods can impact the environment and wildlife is actually through the spread of invasive species. So this is kind of a cool concept where you think about negative impacts being things like animals getting washed away or their habitat getting washed away or being destroyed. But if you think about it, water, if it floods enough, it goes out of riverbanks and it goes on land and it can actually connect different watersheds. And so this is an apple snail. It is an invasive species. It is non-native to the United States. It's found in South America. It was initially introduced due to aquarium trades, I believe, but it was introduced somehow into the United States initially. But one way in which they're spreading is through floodwaters. So what the snail will do is it'll actually it'll store air within its shell that'll make it float in the water. And so when floodwaters get high enough or storm waters get high enough, they'll float in the water and move and disperse rapidly to other areas. And so that's causing these apple snails to expand their range throughout the Florida and some of the Southeast. And that's not the only animal that does that. There's other hurricanes reported that have moved hundreds of species or over 100 different species in a single storm event that's helped move populations of invasive species. So it's a really important impact to consider. It's a really easy mode of dispersal or transportation of animals, whether it be intentional or not. It's something that's causing the spread of invasives, which is then going to increase things like competition, or they could alter environments. So these are rice fields, and so they do well at eating in these rice fields, which is going to reduce the yield of these farms and these fields. So they can have impacts on people and the environment in general. So I thought that was a really cool side effect, or something that we may not consider too much when thinking about how natural disasters can have some lasting effects. And so with that, that's all I have. I'm gonna see if there's any questions. I don't see any, but I hope you all learned a lot. Hopefully this helps keep people safe, and that you found it interesting, because natural disasters are really important. So I hope you all learned something and enjoyed this, and take care. We'll see you soon. Bye.